Very lucky to have Dr. William Burt, the snowstorm could not stop him, who is currently the Chief Ocean Scientist of Planetary Technologies, come speak to us tonight. Planetary Technologies is a local company working to fight climate change by aiding ocean removal of atmospheric carbon dioxide by enhancing ocean alkalinity. And Dr. Burt actually completed his PhD here at Dalhousie University back in 2015, where he studied marine carbon and nutrient cycles using isotopic tracers in the Bedford Basin, the Scotian Shelf, and then also the North Sea. He completed an NSERC postdoctoral fellowship at UBC, studying phytoplankton dynamics using shipboard and satellite-based techniques, so I'm sure a lot of very stormy days. And he was a faculty member at the University of Alaska Fairbanks for over 2 years, prior to being pulled back to Canada and getting his job at Planetary Technologies in January 2022, where he is conducting some really exciting work that he'll talk to us about today. So welcome, Dr. Burt, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Planetary is a small startup. We're located in Dartmouth. We've got about 20 odd people working at the company now. And our mission is here on the slide: restore the climate, heal the ocean. And I'm going to talk about how we go about doing that for the next 40 minutes or so. So I want to start by saying that everything I will show here comes from a whole lot of work, not only from the 20 odd people at Planetary, but a really huge network of support that we have. And a lot of the support I want to talk about today is coming from one place, which is Dalhousie University, which I've circled there. It's been an amazing collaboration with that group, and a lot of the data, well, some of the data I'm going to show, and a lot of the work and has gotten us here because of Dalhousie scientists and the Dalhousie Oceanography Department. So thank you for that. This is the basic outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the motivation for this work, which is pretty obvious, all that horrible stuff in the corner there. The solution, or at least what I call a small part of the solution. I'll go through it really fast some of the R&D that we've done over the past couple of years. I call it hyperspeed R&D because being a scientist at a startup company is a little different than being an academic. And then I'll talk about Halifax and our trial. So I'll start on my soapbox at the beginning, which is normal when you talk about climate change. And then I'll go down a few rabbit holes when I talk about the science as well. Just a warning. Okay. So why are we doing this? Well, it's obvious. There's way too much atmospheric carbon dioxide, like way too much. The atmospheric CO2 is up 50% from industrial times. The global temperatures are going up. Even with dramatic emissions reductions, the estimates are that temperatures will go up pretty dramatically, going towards 2100. Emissions reductions are being implemented, but too slowly for a long time now, and they won't be enough. So the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC in 2022, released this to say that we need to start thinking about not only reducing our emissions, but also actively removing them at really big scales. So this is just showing emissions over time. This big gray blob is the emissions we have now, and over time that's going to have to come down. But this blue color is the addition of removal technologies, of actually actively taking CO2 out of the air and storing it in various places. And what that blue color is showing you is that by 2030, we need about 2 to 3 billion tons of CO2 to get stored out. And by 2050, that needs to go up to about 10 billion tons. So to put whatever 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide into context for you, that means that the industry of carbon removal needs to grow to be about the size, 2 to 3 times the size of the current oil production globally, which is ridiculous and terrifying. That's my emoji of choice when I think about the scales at which this stuff needs to happen in order to sort of avoid the scariest parts of the climate crisis. Now, I want to talk really, really clearly about this idea of net zero as it relates to carbon dioxide removal. And we got this slide actually from Dr. Katja Fennell at Dalhousie, who I think she likes to hammer this point home, and I think it's really important. So here's what current emissions look like. Huge, huge amounts of emissions. CDR stands for carbon dioxide removal it's shown there as a little slice, but it's microscopic. You can't even see it. We're doing tiny amounts right now. So the net is all net emission. Some people think that what our company and other companies like ours is trying to do is grow the carbon dioxide removal so big that emissions doesn't need to be reduced. We'll just suck it all out of the air and we can go on as usual. And the problem with that is that this is not really feasible, or I shouldn't say not really, it's totally not feasible. We won't be able to go to this length, and that won't work for net zero. Now, what might work is reducing our emissions really dramatically, and then the last bit that we can't remove, or we can't reduce, sorry, we remove it, and that gets us to net zero. So this idea of the good and bad net zero is really important to drive home. Now, maybe there's a world in which we do scale CDR really big and we end up being net negative, which is kind of what we need to do. We need to take the legacy emissions out of the air that are already up there in the long term. But, let's one step at a time. Let's just reduce our emissions, grow CDR to cancel out the rest. And the really important driving message here is that emissions reduction is still by far the most important lever we have in the fight against the climate crisis. So hopefully that resonates. But the point is also that we need to reduce and we need to remove carbon pollution. And companies like mine think the ocean is the place to do that. And I think that's pretty obvious. Carbon dioxide removal can look like growing trees. Anyone who follows sort of carbon credit markets in the past know that growing trees is not the best way to permanently remove carbon. In Nova Scotia, where forest fires are raging these days, I would argue that's a good point too about growing trees. You can also develop giant fans to suck air out of the suck CO2 out of the air. That's happening now as well. Now we need all these things. We need all the tools we can get. But the oceans is by far the biggest reservoir in contact with the atmosphere for carbon. So we need a portfolio of solutions, but it must include the oceans, because look at how big the oceans are relative to everything else in terms of storage capacity. Now, another way of looking at this is just the sheer amount of carbon in these reservoirs. So if you took all the carbon in the atmosphere, it would fit in 3/4 of a milk jug. The equivalent in the ocean is basically a full bathtub. That's how much stored carbon capacity there is in the oceans. So to meaningfully reduce the amount of atmospheric CO2, so pouring out some of that milk jug into the bath, you'd see a noticeable change in the amount of carbon in that milk jug, but you wouldn't notice much of anything in that bathtub in terms of the level. So all we need to do is increase the ocean's carbon content by a fraction of 1%, and we can make a dent in the atmospheric CO2 levels. Now, another reason why I like the type of removals that we do at Planetary is that they can get really big. And if you looked at that plot I showed of the IPCC, we need these solutions to get really big. That's the scale of the challenge in front of us. So it's well known that this type of removal is the most scalable, and that's one of the reasons it's appealing. Okay, so how do we increase the ocean's carbon content by a fraction of a percent? The way in which we do that is mimicking a natural process, essentially the geological carbon cycle. So when rain falls on Earth, it takes a little bit of CO2 out of the air with it on its way down, becomes slightly acidic. It dissolves the rocks on land. Those rocks make their way into rivers and flow down into the ocean. And that dissolved rock material goes into the ocean as stored carbon. And that process has been going on for billions of years. And it's actually the process that most drives our climate over long time periods. So this whole burning climate problem we have will be taken care of by the Earth in like 10 million years or 100 million years. That will, find balance. Problem is we don't have that much time, not even close. So we're aiming to speed this up. And we do that using something called Ocean Alkalinity Enhancement, which is an acronym I don't like, but it's not mine, so I'm stuck with it. The ocean and the atmosphere are more or less in equilibrium when it comes to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide can move from the ocean to the atmosphere back and forth. If you add an antacid, or the ground up rock material I mentioned in the previous slide, you actually reduce the acidity of the ocean. And that's a really important point that I don't actually have a slide for it, but folks here who have heard of ocean acidification, it is a really big problem all around the world. And the nice, co-benefit of this process is that you are actually adding an antacid. You're adding a material that reduces acidity. So I'll speak about it a little bit more in a minute, but by doing that, you actually reduce the amount of carbon dioxide gas in the ocean. You reduce the amount of acidity with the antacid. So now you've got this sort of imbalance. And what happens is the CO2 in the air naturally invades into the ocean to fill that void. And you re-establish equilibrium, and that has driven CO2 out of the air and pushed it into the ocean. There's a big fancy chemical equation for that down here, but the simplified version of it is that you're taking carbon dioxide, you're adding what's called a hydroxide, which is a base, or that's what's in the antacid, and you're combining that to form something called bicarbonate, which is just essentially a salt. And that salt, that bicarbonate ion, is stable in the ocean for 10 to 100,000 years. So it's a very, very stable and permanent form of carbon storage, which is also a really important point. So you don't want things that are going to reverse themselves in 10, 50, 100, 200 years. These things need to be permanent. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox now and answer one of the questions you may have already, which is, what is this guy talking about? Is this really going to work, and is it going to be safe? It's kind of the killer question here, right? That's the million, billion, trillion-dollar question. And back in 2021, Dalhousie, a group of professors at Dalhousie wrote a grant to study this. It was very, very, very new at that time, still fairly new, but growing quickly. And that was our first grant in 2021. Since then, it's really taken off. So there's now 4 different grants, all run through Dalhousie, including the one you may have heard of last year, the Transforming Climate Action Grant, which was $153 million. Not all focused on this work, obviously, but a significant piece of the work is focused on climate solutions in the ocean. And it's incredible. So there's an amazing amount of momentum now to study this. We've now moved onto the West Coast, where we're working with my old colleagues at UBC in a very similar way to sort of study this in a different environment. And who knows what's coming next, but I can say that climate solutions is a very, very exciting topic to philanthropic funders, government funders. This is the sort of science that people are excited to do. So I'll start by talking about that first grant, because those were our initial sort of first experiments. Right when I joined the company, we started doing carbon removal in beakers. And this is kind of what it looks like in Doug Wallace's lab at Dalhousie, where we just added this sort of what's called magnesium hydroxide antacid to seawater beakers. And really what you're seeing when you do that over and over again is that you do reduce the acidity in that beaker. So you actually increase the pH. You bring the alkalinity of the seawater up because you are enhancing alkalinity, hence that acronym. And then you see over a slower time period that the carbon content of that seawater goes up. And that's the proof in the pudding when it comes to that carbon dioxide from the air invading into the seawater in the beaker. Some colleagues at the University of Miami, slightly different place, reproduced a similar experiment. We were in collaboration with them when we started this up, but they've published that paper a couple of years ago showing more or less the same thing. And that is that this does work in a beaker. Important point, right? It's very easy to prove things out in beakers. I'm a marine chemist. That's why I love chemistry so much. It's easy relative to some other things. But there's a long way to go from there. So next we went to the Dalhousie Aquatron. So sort of pool scale ocean alkalinity enhancement. And what you're going to see when I play this is that there's like a whole flurry of activity. And that's a nice visual for kind of the chaos that I'm proud to say I brought on when I came into Dal to do this work. A whole bunch of people all sort of swarming around, helping out with various techniques, various instruments put in the pool there. There's me filling up the tank. I'm stirring it with a kayak paddle. In case you've noticed that, the alkalinity went zooming into the pool there for a second. And then we studied it for a couple of weeks. We put lots of tools in. We had a model of the aquatron done by Dr. Ruth Musgrave, and that was all very fun and exciting in 2022. So the other big part of that work was starting to look at the safety, right? So this is something called a mesocosm set up in Halifax Harbor. This was Dr. Hugh McIntyre's lab that did this work, and his student Michaela. They have sort of control mesocosms and alkalized ones, and that work was done in 2022 and will be going in to this this new journal issue that's coming out that's all about environmental impacts of ocean alkalinity. It's going to be out in a couple of months. There's going to be a whole swath of papers in there, a lot of work from Dr. McIntyre's group, including, I think, one of the people on this call, Jess, if you can hear me. So a lot of the early dedicated research into this is super encouraging. I wouldn't say it's surprising, and I'll talk about why that is in a minute, but the negative impacts of this type of thing only seems to show up when you do it at really extreme levels. And I think we can all agree that doing anything at extreme levels is not a great idea. And this is another one of those examples. So we know some of the bars we need to stay well below, and that's really, really useful. But it's very encouraging to know that, at the more moderate concentrations, things are looking pretty safe. It's also really important to note that adding alkaline materials to natural systems is not a new thing. And that's particularly the case in Nova Scotia. An experiment to study the feasibility of rehabilitating acidified salmon habitat. So we're putting alkaline material into our rivers here in Nova Scotia. We've been doing that for decades to keep those habitats less acidic, and it's actually a very effective way to restore salmon populations. They're putting lime in the forests in Nova Scotia, helicopter liming. Didn't know about that a year ago, but this is another way in which you can help an ecosystem by adding sort of an antacid material. So using alkaline material to restore and heal, which is kind of fun that the word restoration is in these titles, is not a new thing. And in wastewater treatment, we've been putting alkaline material in for decades and decades to treat that water before it enters the ocean. Okay, so let's move to what we actually did in the field, which started in late 2022 in a place called Cornwall in the UK. I'm not going to talk much about that work simply because I don't have time. And I think folks here probably want to focus more on what we did this past fall in Halifax. So that's what I'll focus on here. So how we go about doing this in the field is shown in this image. We add this alkaline material through an existing pipe structure, or what we call an outfall. There's a bunch of reasons for doing that. One, you don't have to build new things, and less infrastructure means less carbon emissions. There's clear permit limits on these pipes, on these outfalls. It's well regulated to how much material and what kind of material, and how to monitor that in these pipes. It's also a lot easier to monitor things in a closed system in a pipe. And in the near term, because the ocean is an incredible diluter of everything, it's actually super scalable just when you're talking about adding it through outfalls. There's a lot of pipes going into the ocean. There's a lot of water flowing through them. So we add the antacid into the pipe at a certain location. We have monitoring systems set up upstream and downstream of that addition point so we can see how we're changing the chemistry in the pipe. Then, of course, we've got a system of ocean monitoring apparati, water sampling, moored systems, vehicles. Then we go into the sediments as well and measure using cores and grabs and imagery to make sure that nothing's going on that shouldn't be down at the seabed. And that brings me back to my title slide. So this is what it looked like last fall at the Tufts Cove power generation station. The antacid went in right here, and I'll show a whole bunch of slides about that. Transforming that CO2 into a bicarbonate somewhere downstream of where we do that addition, the CO2 will invade into the ocean and do what it needs to do. So what you may recall, if you followed this project at all last year, is that in August and September, we turned the harbor pink. And I shouldn't say we, It was a team effort. In fact, the Dalhousie research team was leading the effort to do the dye tracing study. And the reason we did that is, well, a whole bunch of reasons. If you see the image down here, you can see the dye really moving its way down through the harbor. And you can't really see it, but there was a boat sort of transecting in and out of that dye patch. And so we were trying to learn how best to sample the water once you've put the alkaline material in, because when you put the alkaline material in, you can't see it. So when you put this dye in, you get a sense of where the stuff's going to go and how you might be able to sample it. Now, it also helps that Dr. Katja Fennell at Dalhousie is building a really amazing ocean model, and she did little dye tracer studies to show where is this dye going to go. And her model is actually now able to forecast where things go in the harbor, which is a skill that very few ocean models actually have. And so she's basically testing the ability of that model to predict by adding that dye and watching it go. So that was what we did in August and September. That was sort of the kickoff. And I'm going to share a couple of things that came from that. The first one was a bunch of Barbie references, which is not surprising. It was right around the time that movie came out. So that was pretty great. But the part I thought was particularly hilarious is somebody with young children and have never done one, but heard of them, is that somebody went and said these gender reveals are getting out of hand, which is something we all took great pleasure in terms of just the coverage of that dye tracer study. So that was pretty fun. Just wanted to share that. But in all seriousness, what we did last fall here was a really, really big deal for the company. What you see in that picture is our sort of monitoring box coming down onto the spill berm in late August. And it's got our mission painted on the side. And this idea of actually going out and doing it for the first time was a really, really big deal. And also, this type of ocean alkalinity enhancement hasn't really been done anywhere else. So not only was it a really big step for Planetary, but it was a really big step for the field, because we're going out and trying to test this and trying to advance scientific research and things like that. So all super exciting stuff. So the container went down, everything went down soon thereafter, and this is what it looked like. And I'll kind of go through what all these different things did. This is just the computer system that helped us keep an eye on all the different tanks and levels and things like that. But it's easier to look at from bird's eye. So you've got like a batch tank here, which is where we add seawater to dry alkaline material, stir it up really well, pump it into a storage tank, keep it there, so that we have enough in the tank to dose at our leisure. And then it gets pumped into this outfall. So this is where the Nova Scotia Power cooling water comes out of the plant and goes back into the harbor. And you can see it comes out of the outfall very frothy because it comes down kind of like a waterfall here in the outfall. So naturally, it's very frothy and bubbly, which actually ended up being quite a pain because a lot of ocean instruments don't like it when you push bubbles through them. So that's a whole other thing. But in the middle here is our brain, is our planetary box that sort of controls everything, all the pumps, all the computing systems, and all the dosing equipment. I put this little flow chart up here, not so much to sort of take you through it in great detail, but just to show how things move from one tank to the next. And more importantly, all the different things we do to sample it on its way through. So for most of the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about all the different data that we collected as Planetary. But it's really important to note that most of the stuff that happened in the ocean was done, or I shouldn't say most of, but a lot more than what I'm going to show here was done by the Dalhousie team. So the Dalhousie team was not out there sort of monitoring our work. They were out there taking advantage of the fact that there was the world's first ocean alkalinity experiment happening, in their harbor. And they took the opportunity to collect an immense amount of data. Now, we did that in close collaboration, but it's important to distinguish what the two different roles were. But our role was to make sure what we put in the ocean at that site was really, really well monitored. Okay, so the first step, going back, is to test the actual material that we're putting in before we put it in. So I call that feedstock sampling. This stuff is called brucite. It's the natural mineral of magnesium hydroxide. Again, the hydroxide is the part that does all the heavy lifting. It, as a chemical, has a very low toxicity to aquatic animals and doesn't persist or bioaccumulate. But we still went through the toxicity testing that was it required? No, it wasn't required, but it was an obvious thing to do. We went out to the Harris Industrial in Waverly. They do stickleback testing, and we gave them some of this material. They ran it through sort of the very classic test that Environment Canada does in any situation like this. And they came back saying, you know, the lethal dose of this stuff is more than 10 grams. More than 10 grams because they didn't test anything higher than 10 grams. They didn't test anything higher than 10 grams because we were adding 1/10 of a gram at our highest maximum concentration. So this was all very positive, not anything that we didn't expect. But we also take this feedstock material and we test the elemental makeup of it, right? Because it's not just pure magnesium hydroxide. There's other stuff in there too. And we have to have a really close understanding of how much the impurities are there as well. So that's another important part of the feedstock testing. Quick shout out to Peter Wells, who's a part of NSIS, and don't know if he's here right now, but he gave me a crash course in ecotoxicity back in September. So Peter, thank you so much for your help, and I'm glad that you were able to link me in with this group as well. Okay, so then it goes into a tank and gets stirred up in that little blue batch tank. It looks like this in the tank. It looks blue because the tank is blue. It's actually white. And we take some of that slurry and we put it in through various different machines to test the chemical composition, the physical composition of that slurry to make sure that the recipe we use to make it, that it has the right stuff in it. So it's just a verification of what we did. So the red line is sort of what we expected the material to have in terms of the weight of alkaline material per weight of seawater. And then we have little validation points all along the way. So this is all during the trial. We tested the pH and the carbon content of the slurry as well. Pretty important in this to actually monitor the amount you put in. So the dosing records are obviously super important. We have a dosing pump that pumps at a known rate, but then there's also level sensors in the tanks and flow meters set up as well. So a really, really close eye on the addition rate. And this is showing the cumulative amount of material we put in over the course of 2 months of the trial. So we sort of split this up into 3 phases. The first one was just the learning phase, you know, just one step at a time, very small amounts of release, on, off for about 3 weeks' time. Then we had the ramping phase. We wanted to understand what was this going to look like, you know, at the next level. For short periods of time, we added it 2 times the dosing rate, 2.5, 3 times the dosing rate that we started to see what we would see. And the exciting thing about that ramping phase is that the max rate we hit, we only hit it for a day, 2 days, was equivalent to about 12,000 tons of carbon removal per year if you were to do it at that rate all year long. And that's just really important because 12,000 is a big number. And, you know, we're not going to get there this year or anything like that, but it's an exciting thing to think that maybe, you know, given what we saw at that rate, that we might be able to get there pretty soon in terms of, you know, taking CO2 out of the air. Then we ran a 24/7 addition period because there's modeling implications to doing it at a continuous rate, and we wanted to test our sort of capabilities on site. Okay, so the next thing is that we took these measurements upstream and downstream of where we dosed. And there's a lot of data in there, but the thing I really want to hammer on for this is that it's very, very important to have your eyes on the receiving waters. And that's really mostly for regulatory compliance. So Nova Scotia Climate Change, Environment Canada was very, you know, clear with us that, you know, there are these limits that you cannot exceed. pH of 9 in the ocean would be unacceptable. You'd have to turn off your instrumentation. We knew we'd never get anywhere close to that level of increase, but that doesn't mean we can't, that doesn't mean we didn't have to be checking. So just showed this little table. This is the kind of stuff we would submit to the regulators to show them that we're not increasing the pH in any negative way. We're not increasing the amount of solids in the ocean, which is another important thing you need to keep your eye on. You can't just be adding tons and tons of particles to the ocean either. So we kept a really close eye on that and kept in touch with the regulator. Now, we did that using a very crude system here. And this is actually, well, taken on the day we did the dye tracing work, just because you can see it a lot better. But, just a multi-parameter probe set up, pumping water up from right outside the outfall. And we collected samples from that system as well and sent them to various labs. Next year, we're hoping to go to a much more sort of robust piece of equipment with more sensors built in line, automatic data acquisition, feedback loops, lots of exciting, additions to that system this year, if we can move ahead. Okay, moving on to the moored system. So now there's everything on the site, and moving off to this float that Nova Scotia Power uses to tie large ships to. And we asked them in the summer, well, hey, can we use that to put some sensors on it? And they said, sure. So here's our team. And actually, it's not just our team, the Dalhousie team is on the float too, adding a set of oceanographic sensors. And you can sort of see them blurry under the water there, measuring all the time. And the data that we got from that was actually super valuable. This is a bit of a messy plot, so I'll walk you through it slowly. Really important to point out before I say anything about it, that this is very preliminary data. So there's calibrations that need to be done on the samples we took every time we visited the system. There's all kinds of different things that need to be done to quality control this data. So very preliminary. It's being looked at most closely by the group at Dalhousie. But it's very interesting nonetheless, just at this rate, at this time. So the blue line is the pH, okay? So the acidity levels in the water, higher acidity means lower pH. So you see these big cycles. And the temptation is to think, oh, this must have to do with what we're doing at Planetary, because the shaded areas are when we're adding alkaline material, and the non-shaded areas is when we weren't. But of course, what you're seeing is that there are these huge natural swings in pH in this area due to tides, due to solar radiation, due to growth of plankton, all sorts of natural processes that change the pH of the system pretty dramatically in this kind of nearshore environment. And the red line is the tidal cycle, which might be a really important driver. So we plotted it on there. But the point is two things. First, the natural variability here is really high, and that poses a big challenge, okay? Because we need to detect a really clear signal on top of that natural variability, and that inherently is going to be challenging. But on the flip side, it also means that the local marine life is really well adjusted to big swings in acidity, and big swings in everything, really, when it comes to the harbor. So, in terms of biological impact, it's very good to see that natural variability is high, but in terms of proving out the technology in the ocean, we're probably going to need to be going at higher rates before we start to see really clear signals, or at least consistently. And that's really unsurprising. We kind of knew that going in. We knew we had to start at a really conservative rate. And so, that is what it is. Okay, this is a bit of a weird sidebar, but I think it's kind of fun. The Dalhousie team also had this amazing autonomous boat. So there's their actual boat. And then you see here, look at that little thing. Kim's driving onto the screen and then just sits there for a minute. That thing is called a blue boat, or at least that's what I call it. It's not a very exciting name, but it's an autonomous little mini platform that it's like a remote control boat. And they started piloting this thing during our trial. You can buy these things off the shelf, but what the Dalhousie team can do is kit it out with all kinds of amazing sensors. And so they did that over the course of the summer and the fall, and they drove it in and out of our pilot plume, or the plume of alkalized waters. And what you're seeing in this plot is kind of the result of that, right? So temperature goes up when the boat drives into the plume, because this is a cooling water loop. So the water that comes out of the power plant is warmer than when it came in. And so you're seeing that increased temperature. You're also seeing an increase in pH when it drives in and out of the plume. And so that is the signal, right? That's a much clearer, it's not, smoking gun or anything, but it's a much clearer way to detect change in pH by driving this boat in and out of the plume. So this sort of technology, which kind of came into the trial very late, is a really exciting way to go about monitoring this. And we're now scrambling to try and put together our own system like this with help from the Dalhousie team. They're also building a bigger and better version of it. And so this is the kind of stuff that comes out of deploying in the field, this new innovative tech that that the sort of DAL team is really at the tip of the spear to develop. Okay, so what else did we do? We monitored the biology, again, through Dr. McIntyre's group. His master student, Marie Eggert, who's also now working as an intern at Planetary, was doing these photosynthetic efficiency measurements. And this is not an easy plot to understand, but really what you need to know is that this metric here on the y-axis is what she doesn't even call it photosynthetic efficiency, but that's my way of saying it. And you could also call it the phytoplankton happiness index if you're me. But sampling that every single day, both upstream and downstream of where we add the alkalinity, and doing statistics on this to see, well, what's changing between upstream and downstream communities in terms of their ability to photosynthesize. And again, not unexpected, but not seeing any discernible change day after day after day. I should note that there's a ton of work that has to go in to building a plot like this. So, the amount of effort put forward by a whole heap of students at Dal, but also our team at Planetary is important to point out. We also, as I said before, kept a close eye on the sediments, right? So we built a drop camera system, and there's a patch of muddy sediment just kind of off the dock from the cooling plant. And we dropped our camera down there every chance we got to take imagery of the seabed, because we wanted to make sure we're not accumulating this alkaline material on the seafloor for obvious reasons. So we built this drop camera system to do that. An even better way was to take the Dalhousie team's sediment cores that they were collecting for a variety of reasons and just look at the imagery, right? Because you've got this cross section of the mud here and the water over top of it. If you're seeing a white film forming on the top, that would be a pretty good indication that you're accumulating stuff on the seabed, which is, of course, we don't want to do. So this is the kind of stuff we need to keep a close eye on. The last thing we've done is scraped the top layer off those cores and running them through an elemental analyzer to see, we don't see anything visually, pardon me, but are we seeing an increase in magnesium, for example, because the stuff is magnesium hydroxide. So this is the next level of testing, and those analyses are still ongoing. Okay, so I'm almost done. What about the carbon emissions? Another really important question. Everything I showed you there has a carbon footprint to it. Every boat ride, every truck driver that brings the material on site. We actually just got our emissions report back from a third party called Long Trail Sustainability. They knock through every single piece of the process to tell you what the emissions footprint is. And it turns out for this particular trial that it was about 150 tons of CO2 used to do it. And a huge part of that footprint, which is, again, not surprising, we had done our homework, is the transport of the material. Now, this material was mined out of the ground, and there's a carbon footprint to that as well. We had to be ground, it had to be transported. So all these things are really important to see the data. So we know what are the components of this process that we need to trim down, because everything we want to do in terms of net removal of carbon, of course, has an emissions as the negative. So to do about 100 tons of removal, which is the number that we were aiming for this trial, we think we may have gotten close to that. That's like 11,000 gallons of gasoline, in terms of the amount of emissions that relates to. So what do we need to do going forward? We need to have material. We need a different material, because you can see it's a pretty big footprint, emissions footprint. We need to do better, but that wasn't the major goal of the trial, was to use a material with a low footprint. So moving forward, 2024, we're not going to get this material. We're not going to mine it out of the ground. We're not going to transport it nearly as far. We're going to do even more rigorous toxicity testing, because that's just the right thing to do. We're going to implement new monitoring systems. I mentioned some of that before, but the Dalhousie team is also putting forward these really cool new systems that you're probably going to see out in the harbor this summer. New different ways of monitoring for biology. We're trying to put together this really, really cool mussel monitoring system that sort of monitors the way they open and close their shells. Environmental DNA is a very powerful tool that we're working with the DAL team to implement. And we've got some trials going hopefully later this year in Vancouver, which is where I grew up, as well as Virginia and in the UK as well. So that's what 2024 has in store. And so the takeaways I have for you tonight are the following. We need carbon removal, but we also need everything else. The biggest lever we have, the biggest tool in the toolbox by far is emissions reduction, but we're going to need more on top of that. Ocean alkalinity is one of those tools. It's probably the biggest one that if it works. Planetary is a world leader in the R&D of ocean alkalinity enhancement. Dalhousie is also a world leader in R&D, and Halifax is a world leader. And that to me is really exciting as someone who's spent much of their life here. The early results are really encouraging, got a long way to go. It's not going to be easy, but this really is a story about hope in the fight against climate crisis. And I hope that this has given you a sense of hope and a sense of pride as folks, as many of us probably here are from Nova Scotia. So with that, thanks so much for listening. Please do get in touch if you have questions beyond this talk. Go on our website, check out the Nova Scotia page. Contact me directly, that's my email down there, or just contact the company. We are hiring, if there are any people out there looking for a gig, not only in Halifax, but in Vancouver as well. And we're hoping to grow a lot in 2024. So hope you're interested, and thanks again.